NFL teams can begin franchise tagging those players that they wish not to reach unrestricted free agency. Who are the names who could get tagged before that deadline? And Tua Tagovailoa, not an unrestricted free agent, but due for a big contract. What is that going to look like? Should the Dolphins give Tua the bag? All that and more coming up on today's Peacock and Williamson.
NFL analyst Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson bring you expert NFL analysis every day in less than 30 minutes. Get an inside look into the NFL on the field and in the front office. With elite breakdowns, next-level analysis, and in-depth information only for the real NFL fans. This is Peacock and Williamson, and it starts now.
Welcome to the Peacock and Williamson NFL Show. Brian Peacock alongside Matt Williamson at BD Peacock at Williamson NFL. Thanks everybody for making us your first listen on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Appreciate all of the everydayers out there, and we love it when you subscribe on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcast. This episode of Peacock and Williamson is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. All right. We got franchise tags going on in the NFL, Matt, and a list of names that get very interesting as teams try to re-sign their players, who will get tagged, who won't get tagged. And would you like to take us all through what it even means with the franchise tag and maybe what some of these position group numbers will be for teams if they're thinking about should we not tag a player?
So I don't know if anyone needs a history lesson of the franchise tag, but I don't know anything about the NBA, but the NBA was very worried that their stars would start changing teams. So they created this Larry Bird rule, which I don't know exactly what that means, but basically they wanted Bird to stay on the Celtics, Magic to stay on the Lakers, Jordan to stay on the Bulls, etc., and build identity and familiarity with their team.
The Bird rights. Yeah.
You might know better than I do what that means.
Yeah, the bird rights. It makes an NBA team, it makes it a lot easier for them to re-sign their own guy because they can go over the salary cap. And it's a soft cap, not a hard cap like the NFL. So they can go above and beyond to bring their own guy back. Essentially, they can pay that player more than a free agent market team would be able to pay that player because they can go over the cap where another team couldn't. That's the basic idea of the bird rights. Just makes it easier for the current team to sign them and pay them more, not just say, hey, you have to stay here and you're an indentured servant to this team that drafted you.
Which was how it was when I was a kid. And, owners were very reluctant to say, we're going to allow free agency to happen at all. Like Reggie White was one of the first big free agents. And I remember that shook the world. He signed for millions with the Packers. Holy smokes, And, I think the owner's pushback was, well, at least give us one guy we can keep. I don't want Tom Brady leaving. I don't want Joe Montana leaving just because they have more money than we do. But it's not how the rule has worked. I mean, now people franchise kickers and, whatever. But how it works is they put out these numbers, which I'll run through real quick. For whatever position you're at, it'll cost you X amount to franchise them. And from what I understand, that's the 5 biggest contracts at that position. And it's the average, so you're being paid like a top 5 guy at your position. But it gets a little sticky because what's TJ Watt? Is he a linebacker or is he a defensive end? Well, you got to make him one or the other. Jimmy Graham was the best example with the Saints. Is he a big receiver who catches a heck of a lot of passes, or is he a tight end? And the number is drastically different. So here are the numbers, and you take these into consideration when your favorite team is considering franchising a player. Quarterback's about $36 million. Linebackers about $23 million, which is really, really high. But as your Niners know better than ever, the elite linebackers, the top 5, the Edmonds, the Roquans, the Warners, are kind of skewing this. So franchising a linebacker is incredibly expensive, and that's not a premium position, but there are 5 to 10 premium guys. So that's a little weird. Defensive tackles about 21, wide receivers about the same, defensive ends about 20. Offensive line is about 20, which is also very dumb because a center and a left tackle are all, quote, offensive line. It should be interior and tackle. It's not. Corners only 19, which isn't too bad. safeties 16, tight ends are 12. So, just to kind of look ahead, a guy like Dalton Schultz is up, and he might get franchised for 12. Is he a top 5 tight end? No, but it's only 12. Running backs are only 11. We went through this last year with Barkley and Josh Jacobs, and kicker punters are like 5.5. So that's what it's all about, is what does your player qualify as, and do we want to keep him at that number? And it's guaranteed. The player does not have to sign the franchise tag. I mean, there's no benefit to signing it right away. And the last one that didn't, I think, was Lev Bell, which ended up being a very stupid decision.
Yeah, and ended up holding out all year. And you see a lot of those where a guy doesn't sign his franchise tag until right before camp or even after camp starts, or ends up doing some sort of a 1-year deal that takes away the tag that gets them a little bit more money, and then makes it so you can't tag him the next year. And so there's still ways to go about it if you get tagged for a player that you're still guaranteed that 1-year salary, but it makes it a little bit more palatable for the player to show up and play under that tag or under that 1-year contract and then hit free agency the next year. And when you lay out the dollars, it's funny because the positions, it's become really the positions that are most likely to get tagged are the ones that either make the most, because then you are making sure that you don't have to sign this long-term contract for a player and you get them for 1 more year, like quarterbacks or say defensive ends and positions like pass rushers, offensive tackles maybe, and running backs and tight ends, because they're sort of underpaid and it hasn't caught up. And there's not enough of those players like linebackers that are skewing things to be more expensive. And so if you're going to sign one of the top running backs, you're actually going to pay them less on that franchise tag for 1 year. And with the attrition at that position, it's almost become a no-brainer and an automatic franchise tag for the best running backs in the NFL, which has made them even more furious based on how things have gone at their position group with how they're being paid. So yeah, running backs and tight ends are probably the best team franchise tag options for positions out there.
Yeah. So last thing I'll say, this kind of generally, is running backs really need like Bijan or even McCaffrey to sign some ungodly $25 million deal. They need Jim Brown to come back from the dead and just demand anything he wants, or Kelsey to sign a big-time wide receiver contract, just because that would be 1/5 of the equation that would bump it back up. And I always talked about this when Aaron Donald was in his prime, D tackles were a pretty decent bargain too for the franchise tag. And for the Rams, it would have been the best bargain ever. Like, he's so much better than everyone in the league. All we got to do is franchise Donald and not make him the highest paid player in the league, which he deserves. So there are some kind of loopholes too.
So with that said, next, Matt, let's go through the names. Who could be franchise tagged in the NFL this offseason? We got to talk about Tua, what that contract could look like, and some other contracts that could get done of players that are not quite reaching unrestricted free agency yet. Today's episode of Peacock and Williamson is brought to you by Game Time. When it's time to buy tickets for your next big event, you shouldn't have to worry about it. There shouldn't be a hassle to get those tickets. You should be super excited to get tickets for the next NFL game you're going to any sporting event out there. Music, comedy, theater events. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all of those events. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. All-in prices show your total up front. This is my favorite feature with Game Time. So you're getting a great deal before you check out, and you don't get hit with those hidden fees at the end. You think you had one price for your tickets, and you realize, oh, this is going to cost me double. That's all up front with Game Time. You buy tickets in seconds, just a couple of taps. They're right there on the Game Time app, so you don't have to go fishing through emails to find the tickets when it comes time to show up to your event. And Game Time has deals right up to the start of your event, and even an hour after it starts. It's the place to find last-minute seats. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So who is getting the franchise tag in the 2024 offseason, Matt, and there's probably not many that will actually get tagged. A lot of players are just going to get re-upped by their teams, and some will just hit the free agent market, and who knows, maybe some tag and trades are potentially out there for some of these. But there's some bigger name players that I would like to talk about, and since we brought up running backs, I think we should start there because we've already gone through this dance with players like Saquon Barkley of the New York Giants and Josh Jacobs of the Raiders.
Yeah, and I don't know if they're going to be in that market again. Jacobs had a rough year. And the other thing we should have probably mentioned before is you have to, if it's a second year in a row, the player gets another bump. I mean, so it's more than that number. Do you have any strong thoughts on Barkley? I mean, if I were the Giants, I might just be done with that. Let him test the waters, get a comp pick and move on. But he's so important for them, and their seat's kind of hot. And I think Jacobs hits the market. I'm not certain about Barkley.
I would play it probably similarly. I mean, it's one thing GMs now, they want to do better for the players than GMs of the past. In the past, this could get much more contentious, and teams would look at a player who, like Tua, for example, that we're going to talk about later. He's on his 5th-year option, so he's under contract. So a GM would say, okay, agent, thanks for calling, but our player's under contract, so we're not worried about it. We'll talk later, and then we'll talk 2 years after that after we franchise tag him twice. You really leverage it. You can play the bad guy. It's much more difficult for teams and GMs to play the bad guy these days as it used to be, and we've already gone through this last offseason with Barkley and Jacobs. I'd be shocked if they both get the tag slapped on them again, and if it is the Giants putting the tag on Barkley again, the dollar amount is going to put them near or at the top of the most highly paid players in the NFL at that position. Right now, it's McCaffrey, which is, I think, right at $14 million per year.
Could be knocking on the door.
Why not sign him to a long-term deal? Because you could lower that cap number this year anyway, and you could cut him in 2 years if you have to, right? So that starts to make less sense anyway. So Saquon, I think, re-signs or hits the market, and I think it's probably similar with Josh Jacobs.
I think you're right about goodwill between teams and players is definitely improved. Like releasing a player now allows them to test the market before free agency starts. I'm surprised there hasn't been more of that. Like Jacksonville, for example, can now start talking contract with Lawrence because you're now allowed. They don't have to, but it's a good thing to do for, well-being, and, players have a little more power.
And if you're the team at this point, you want to go through all this, because watch what Tua's going to make. I would rather sign
time now
Trevor Lawrence before I see what Tua gets, because Trevor Lawrence should get more than Tua, and he's definitely going to get more than Tua and maybe some other guys with the money going up and up and the cap going up and up. So that'll be interesting to see how someone like Trevor Lawrence's camp even wants to play this. If they say, nah, we'd rather do this deal in 2 years because we think it'll be that much bigger. It'll be $60 million instead of $50 million a year.
And then the other a-hole thing that teams can do too is, hypothetically, we're talking running backs. Jags can put the tag on Barkley. He doesn't sign it. He has no reason to sign it because, it doesn't do him any good at this point. They draft one in the second round, and then they rescind the tag, and no team has any cap space left to go get him. It's kind of dirty pool too,
Right. Yeah, so there's a lot of options for the teams, and you can see why teams in the past, say the Tennessee Titans, and they want to get A.J. Brown at a certain number, and he wants a lot more. But to them, they're like, well, you're not a free agent. When you become a free agent, you don't get the most money by any team in the league. But right now, we're the only team you can negotiate with. And then we could franchise tag you next offseason if we want to. And so that's the situation where they say, well, whatever. You go find your money with the team and bring back a first-round pick. And that's what ended up happening. We've seen that happen on occasion. And I think we could see that happen right now with the T. Higgins and Michael Pittmans of the world for the Colts, and the Bengals are interesting players. And with the value of wide receivers going up and up and up, and these two teams, Higgins is a nice player, but I just don't know if there's one player who's going to be traded, a tag and trade, it would seem like T. Higgins is the guy. Pittman less so, because even though you don't want to pay him maybe number one money, because maybe he's not quite there as a player, he's still a really good player. And the Colts don't have Jamar Chase also on the roster.
That's a great point. So those two are similar. Neither was a first-round pick. I think they both will get the tag. But the other thing that we haven't talked about is that Also, this buys you time to, set up a long-term deal too. We have exclusive rights to talk. Maybe you don't sign the tag. Maybe this gives us more time to see how the market goes. You're off the market. We sign you to a 3-year deal. But I don't think either one of those guys is going anywhere. This has been discussed a lot with the Chiefs. The Chiefs have Chris Jones and Snead up. Well, they have a deal with Jones that they can't franchise him again. But the Bucs with Mike Evans, since we're talking receivers, would you rather franchise Mike Evans at the receiver number or Antoine Winfield at the safety number? You wouldn't think the Bucs would be in this bind. The Super Bowl champ, you get the bind, but the Bucs, it's like, oh no, we got to make some decisions here.
And we saw this last year with the Giants and the whole Daniel Jones Saquon Barkley thing, and it's like, okay, well, we need to use the tag on one of these guys, so we got to do a deal with the other, and maybe that makes your timeline speed up where you pay a guy quickly because you want to be able to use the tag on the other guy before that deadline.
And obviously, if you're a team with a ton of cap space, this gets easier too. We can afford to do the 1-year deal, franchise, maybe chat, contract with them during camp or the season or whatever too. So yeah, there's a lot of those instances. It gets hairy.
You mentioned Winfield there. That's an obvious one that could be a franchise tag player. Christian Wilkins of the Dolphins is another one.
They just don't have any money.
Yeah, and they've got to do a huge deal with Tua.
Right. Miami's in a real precarious situation. I think I said this the other day, but as I've studied free agency, the teams that are going to get hit hardest, is my guess, is Baltimore, who Matabuke, much like Miami with Wilkins, are strong candidates to be franchised. And you probably think, well, they're not exactly Aaron Donald. Yeah, but that's kind of how it works. You just don't want that homegrown stud talent coming off a great year to leave. But I think Baltimore and Miami could be in some rough waters to try to navigate all this stuff. But the difference is one of them has a quarterback signed long-term and the other one doesn't.
Any other names that jump out to you for franchise tag potential? I know Adam Schefter dropped a list of players that had, edge rusher Josh Allen of the Jacksonville Jaguars on there. Big one is Brian Burns for.
I think they're both locks.
Are they their lock franchise tag, or are they locked?
I think so. Yeah, I think they're locked.
Are they trade possibilities?
Well, that's the other thing too, is, Burns comes to mind for Carolina. Like, if you're the Panthers, you have very few assets. You can't just let him walk out the door for a 3rd-round pick. I mean, at a minimum, franchise him and listen to offers, or franchise them and build around them and actually have good players for one.
And maybe he just doesn't want to do a deal with you. In that case, you get what you can and franchise tag and trade him.
Maybe get a 2nd-round pick or a future one or something like that. The Bears, like Carolina, have a ton of cap space. I think Jalen Johnson gets a tag, and I think that's kind of smart with corners. Like, if you look at the top 5 to 8 corner salaries out there, it's such a volatile position. Some of these guys aren't great corners for 2-3 years in a row. Franchising a Jalen Johnson or a Snead makes a lot of sense. Gives me a whole year to evaluate him, and in case his play drops off. He's not exactly a Sauce Gardner, Jalen Ramsey-like prospect coming out of school either, but they've had great years.
A lot easier for the Bears than the Chiefs too. If
exactly.
You're franchising a corner, just because you have all that money now guaranteed on the books now, and you can't backload a contract and make that easier for you in year one, which I think is much more likely for the Bears to tag someone like Jalen Johnson, who they couldn't get a deal done with during the season, or than it is for the Chiefs with L'Jarius Sneed.
Yeah, I'm 100% on board with that. The other ones, I don't think Tony Pollard gets it, although running backs aren't that expensive. I think he hits the market. Kirk Cousins, deep down, I don't think will leave Minnesota, but I mean, I don't know the exact rules on this, but he got franchised several times by Washington. I think that whole clock starts over with a new team, so I guess that could be a guy. And Dalton Schultz, I mentioned earlier, just because it's $12 million for Dalton Schultz, that's not so bad. They have a lot of cap space too.
He's a good player. Although
he's a good player. Yeah.
Probably do a 2-year deal, 3-year deal with him. Mm-hmm. Probably be better than the tag, unless he thinks he can get some crazy contract that he's not going to get top of the market tied in money either. So that's a deal I feel like should get done before it even gets to the tag.
Yes. So the last thing I have really from the franchise perspective is some players most players hate getting tagged because they want the huge signing bonus. They want to, try to get 3 big contracts at the NFL level, a little more security where you're going to live for the next couple of years. But some players love it. Like Jalen Johnson by NFL standards hasn't made squat. You know what I mean? Jadarius Sneed is not one made squat. Like, I know this because it's a Steeler thing, but I mentioned Lev Bell. If Bell would have signed the franchise deal, that would have been more than all his earnings to date, and that's going to be the case with these guys too. Like, hey, I get to be a free agent after this year. It's guaranteed money. If you're Jalen Johnson or Sneed, you've made nothing and you're about to make, 19 or 20, whatever I said, like, wow, I'll take that for 1 year. I mean, Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Sneed are like, yeah, franchise them. You know what I mean?
Let's get some money somehow.
Yeah.
Start getting that big money.
Or you get hurt or have a bad year,
Before we move on to Tua and some quarterback decisions to be made, other wide receiver decisions that need to be made as well. Speaking of the 5th-year option that Tua is on, Brandon Ayuk, first-round pick from that draft, also on a 5th-year option. CeeDee Lamb, there's talked about with Ayuk, he could potentially be a trade candidate. There was some things he did on social media that were a little weird after the Super Bowl. They've already got Debo paid, so the 49ers have to figure out some things there with him, and usually going into your last year of your deal, teams try to get that done and get that long-term contract done. So big contracts for Lamb, a big contract for Brandon Ayuk potentially coming up this offseason. Of course, Jefferson with the Vikings and Kirk Cousins. There's a lot to figure out with
there's a lot.
The Vikings put that thing together right now. And another interesting one is Calvin Ridley, who very likely will not get re-signed by the Jaguars, because if the Jags re-sign Ridley, they give up their 2nd-round pick to Atlanta,
pretty crazy.
which would be number 48 overall. And if they don't, then they'll give up their 3rd-round pick, which is number 79, and they could get a comp 3rd, potentially even back, depending on what Ridley gets on the open market too. So I think Ridley gone from Jacksonville.
And I think they franchise Allen, the defensive end. But they were also talking about cutting Zay Jones, who's got a pretty inflated contract. Could you potentially lose Ridley and Jones? Like, Jacksonville's another team. It's a little hairy too.
Jacksonville. Hey, Brandon Ayuk to Jacksonville. That's maybe a trade that matches up if something like that ends up happening, and then you tag Josh Allen so you don't lose the edge guy that you would have to draft in the 1st round if you lost him instead. So some interesting happenings to come for sure in the NFL. There will be tags, there will be trades. And of course, it's draft season, but let's talk.
Like, all these mocks are awesome, but all these things have to happen before you can mock anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, like, whatever. And that's why need-based mocks are so difficult, and because those needs are going to change throughout March before we get to April.
Yep, it's about to get real fun.
Next, Tua. Should the Miami Dolphins throw the bag at Tua? What's this going to look like? And there are some other looming quarterback contracts as well. Next. This episode of Peacock and Williamson is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 extra to play with at FanDuel if your bet wins. And bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams on America's #1 sports book with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and I know NFL season's over, but NFL draft props are some of the best fun you can have betting on FanDuel. And I think some of the biggest advantages you could have if you know your stuff at this point in the offseason. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Tua. This is an interesting one. And I've seen a lot, Matt, in recent off seasons, particularly a lot with the team I cover, the 49ers, but you see it in other places as well. And we're seeing it with the Chicago Bears. A lot of people are like, "Oh, rookie contract. You got to draft Caleb Williams because of the rookie contract." And I just think it's a backwards way of looking at the quarterback position. The goal should never be for an NFL team to have a cheap quarterback. The goal should be to have a great quarterback.
Right.
Great quarterback's expensive, fine, because any great quarterback's going to become expensive anyway. So that's fleeting, having a cheap guy for a year or two. You should want a great quarterback, not a cheap quarterback. Now, the big thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to pay a bad or mediocre quarterback like a great quarterback. And that's
That's
where
the
you're going to get
mistake.
in trouble, right? And so where is Tua on that scale for you? And according to reports, they're working hard, and this is going to be probably a big deal for Tua. He's going to get a lot of money, and that's going to happen pretty soon.
This is a really tough one for me, to be honest with you. Like, we always have at least an episode or two about Mike Sando's quarterback tiers from The Athletic, friend of the show. And I kind of like to put it in those terms that if you're a tier 1 guy, here's a blank check, whatever you write down, great. We're just thrilled to have you, Josh Allen, et cetera. Okay. Obviously Mahomes and some others, whatever. It's worth it. I have a great quarterback, mission accomplished. I'm one of the 5 teams that can say that. But if you're a true tier 2 guy, I think you say, I'm pretty happy with things. We're going to give you big money, top of the market, slightly under the biggest dogs in the league, but I'm quite happy with it. Dak Prescott comes to mind for me. Like, if the Jags can get Lawrence at that type of deal at this stage of his career, I think you're pretty happy about it. I know some people are down on Dak. He's a loser. He can't win in the postseason. You'll never beat Mahomes with that guy. I don't necessarily believe those things. I think you're pretty happy to have a top 8 quarterback in Prescott, who was in MVP conversation for much of the year. People seem to forget that. I don't put Tua in that light, though. Like Hurts, Herbert, Burrow are the same draft class, and I would think Tua's agent goes to the Dolphins with those contracts in hand, saying, this is our guideline. We want to be in this range. And I'm going to say, Mr. Tua, Mr. Tagovailoa, I can't be quite in that range. I need a little more. I need some outs. I really think he's gotten better and better. I thought he was a questionable player a couple years ago, but I think he's coming off his best year. He's not just a product of the system in the Brock Purdy-like manner. I think he fits the system great, and they coach around his abilities great. But that's a good marriage to me, and I think you should keep him in the end. But how it's structured and how it's worded to me is super important. Am I stuck on? I can't give him guaranteed money over 3 or 4 years, or you know what I mean. I need to be able to get out.
And I buy both sides of this argument.
Yeah, it's tough
because there are teams out there that would love to have Tua level quarterback play. And I always come back to this. It's like, man, what if the Jets had at least a Tua playing quarterback for them last year? How much different does their season go? And I think he's going to get paid. And, the reports are that Tua and the Dolphins are moving quickly and aiming to get an extension done, which means that he's going to get a lot of money. But as was asked in the mailbag to us, that eventually a team is going to do something that's pretty difficult. And there's a lot of number 1 jerseys in the stands for Miami. So that's part of it too. There's a marketing aspect. You've got your franchise quarterback. You drafted him top 5. There was a whole tank for Tua movement before the draft even happened. Right. So a lot of people are invested in Tua there. To be able to just start that over takes a lot of guts. And especially for a regime that's in place and a team that's trying to win right now, because you replace quarterback, you might get a lot worse before you get a lot better at that position. And then now coaches are getting fired and GMs are getting fired. So it takes a lot of guts and probably has to come from ownership on down for situations like this. But the idea that you're like, nope, you're not in that tier. So we're going to trade you. We're going to go back. We're going to roll the dice again, and we're going to try it again in the draft, and we're going to try to do some other things and see if we can get closer to the Mahomes tier of quarterback. Something is eventually going to do it, but it's easier said than done, and we don't see it for a reason. But I understand how someone from the outside looking in could say, gosh, you know what? Just don't do it. Trade Tua for what you can get and try again. See if you can get even better.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, would the Vikings, the Falcons, the Giants give you their first-round pick for him right now? Doesn't sound so bad. I mean, I considering what they've played with, I mean, yeah, you get something good for them.
How about this? Let me put it this way to you.
Yeah.
Let's say it's the Giants or some team that's drafting pretty high.
Yeah, Atlanta.
You could trade Tua and end up with a pick that's within range of maybe adding a little something else to get Jaden Daniels.
Yeah.
Would you do that if you're the Dolphins right now? We're like essentially Tua, and maybe you have to give up a little something to make sure you move up and you're in the right spot to draft that player. Would you swap Tua essentially for Jaden Daniels?
I mean, it's kind of the whole Fields-Williams conversation, just in terms of timeline, money, age, all those things. And
Tua
played, bird
in
in the hand.
Tua's played better than Fields has.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't be getting the prospect that the Bears have the option of getting at number one either.
The gap isn't as wide.
Yeah. So the Bears conversation's easy to me. You draft Williams because again, it's not about getting a cheap quarterback. It's about getting the best quarterback. But if you're already on the clock and under the gun to have to pay a quarterback, and maybe it's even closer than that, it's interesting. It is
interesting. So I don't know the answer to your question. I'm not trying to ignore it, but it's a tough one. But I do know the answer to the question of, even when you don't need a quarterback, unless you have the quarterback, and there's only a couple of those, draft Jalen Hurts in the second round. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you at least have the option. You know, like if they would have drafted, we don't have much time, but the Lions are kind of in this predicament with Goff. Everyone thinks they're going to resign him, extend him. They're going, well, I think they should. But if Hendon Hooker looks like Mahomes in practice during his redshirt year, well, then I turn Goff into a first-round pick, and then Hooker's sitting there. You know what I mean? Like Herndon Hooker. I forget. I didn't call his name the right name.
Hendon Hooker.
Hendon? I thought it was Herndon. Oh, yeah, you're right. It's Hendon.
Hooker. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Last year's prospects are getting erased in my brain because I'm replacing with this year's prospect in my my memory card's full up here. But
so if you're not sure, draft Spencer Rattler. If you're in this predicament a year from now, draft Spencer Rattler in the third round, and at least you have another option that's tempting. You know,
maybe you got something there.
You know what I'm saying? That's the Hurts pick. You know what, they had Wentz under contract, but this guy's too good to pass up. When in doubt, take a day 2 quarterback. You know.
And do you think? So I have a feeling Goff and Dak are going to go to the end like Cousins did, and they're going to play those contracts out and not do the new deals. With those guys entering walk years this year. That's the feeling I get. So we'll see if that ends up happening.
Interesting. Yeah, it's quite the puzzle to put together.
One more quick note on the 5th-year option players like Tua, Brandon Ayuk, CeeDee Lamb, those 2020 draft picks, the first rounders that their 5th-year options were picked up. Those players, it's a lot easier to hold out because you don't get the automatic fines like you can. And we saw it last offseason with Nick Bosa, took it all the way down to the wire. So those guys can hold out and hold their teams to it a little bit more. So all those 5th-year option guys are looking for new big-time contracts and will probably unlikely, in some cases they might, but most of them unlikely to play under that 5th-year option.
That's a great point. Yeah, because, I mean, some of these holdouts, like Chris Jones last year, held out and just paid a ton of money, you know.
Thanks, everybody, for making us your first listen here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We've got a mailbag coming up as we do every Wednesday on tomorrow's episode. So drop us a question on Twitter at BD Peacock, at Williamson NFL, or you can drop a question in the YouTube comments as well. Make sure you are subscribed up on YouTube. Hit the thumbs up. We appreciate you. And you can subscribe everywhere you get your podcasts. Matt and I back tomorrow right here, Peacock and Williamson.